Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? Well, let's do a very quick introduction to social network analysis. And then I'm going to talk about active and passive network analysis examples. And that's going to make a lot more sense when we get there. But essentially, you can think of it as active is you have to go out and collect your data from people. And then passive is kind of all the stuff that's being collected in the background as we're going, such as Zoom recordings, emails, Slack communication, all of that all of our communication is being collected in the background. And so that also forms really, really interesting networks. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can design network interventions and how that might help you understand, how relationships form and change over time. So let's start with an example. So I have a question for you. How would you think about visualizing the following information about these friendship relations between these four individuals? And so there's Bob, Carol, Ted, and Alice. So if you have a pen and paper in front of you, then you might as well just get it out and, and think about how these relationships, how would you map them out? So Bob says he's friends with Ted and Alice. Carol says she's friends with Bob and Alice. Ted says he is friends with Carol and Alice. And Alice says that she is friends with Bob. I'll just give you 5 more seconds. All right, so how do people think you should visualize this kind of information? Is there a way that you would think is more intuitive to you than another way? I think we can just call out maybe. Okay, or show your screen, yeah. Okay, so Haley looks at it as a sociogram or a network. How did other people similarly as a network or in a different format? All right. All right. Okay. So we all think about it in networks already. So yeah, so I think that's a very intuitive way to think about it. But also there's like alternative representations as well. And all of these convey similar amounts of information, like thinking about it as in terms of an adjacency matrix where of ones and zeros, and a 1 represents a friendship and a 0 represents the absence of a relationship. And so that's another way that you can think about representing this kind of data. And then there's yet another way that I think is less intuitive, but sometimes it makes sense. It's an edge list. And so you can think of it as 2 columns. And on the left-hand side, it's the person called the ego who is just choosing the friend. And then the alter is the person who's the choice. And so these are just, 2 alternative representations. And then the third one is pretty much what all of you kind of defaulted to, which I think makes sense. You're given information. Also, this is we're talking about networks. And so this is a sociogram representation. So let's dissect this network a little bit more and talk a little bit about the terminology of who everybody is. So Ted, Carol, Bob, and Alice are the actors, or they're called the nodes in the network. And then the arrows represent the relationships and the edges in the network. And then in this case, the edges are self-reported and they're directed friendship relationships between the nodes in the network. Because we surveyed these people and they reported these relationships. So what can we learn from a network? And this is just a toy example, but we can think about a network as the entire representation of these 4 people and the links or the edges that link them together, or the relationships between them. But we can also think about things at the individual level, the subgroup level, and then which can include dyads or triads. And so one thing that's really common that people tend to like to think about is the centrality of each person or the nodes in the network. And so centrality really allows us to identify the most important nodes in the network. And one popular measure is the degree of the node, which is the number of relations that a node has. And so if I asked you another question, who is the most central or influential person in the social network, would you say that it's Ted, Carol, Bob, or Alice? Yeah, we can just use, maybe we use the chat and you can just call out, yeah, Alice. Does everybody agree that it's Alice? Or are there other options?
I'm actually unsure.
Okay.
It seems like
Okay.
it depends, I guess, how we're counting which direction the relationship is going in.
I would say Bob is the one more involved.
Right. So yes, it is a kind of a trick question because this is a directed network. So it matters if we're talking about the in degree. So how many people are claiming you as a friend? So Alice is really popular in that sense because 3 people are saying Alice is my friend. The out degree though is the number of outgoing relations. And so these are the people that say that, you know, so for example, let's see, Bob thinks that Ted and Alice are his good friends. And so those are, you know, this is like how outgoing or outward you are. And then there's a total degree, which is the count of the in degree and the out degree. And so, yeah, it was kind of a trick question. And I think it's really just to show that there's different interpretations and it really depends on what you're interested in. And so that's exactly what this kind of table is supposed to show. So you see that Alice is the highest in terms of in degree, so she is influential in that sense. But Ted actually has the same out degree, and so he thinks that more like lots of people are his friends in this network, and that could be a good thing as well. And then finally, if you're thinking about total degree, then there's Bob and Alice there. And then similarly, you know, we just thought about, you know, the individuals or the actual nodes in this network, but then something that's kind of cool about social networks is that once you have a network in front of you or you've mapped out those relationships, you can think about things in little clusters. And so we talked about individuals, but you can also think about subgroups such as dyads. And so those are, you know, 2 nodes, and it asks whether those 2 nodes are mutually linked in a network. And so in this example, we just have one mutual edge, and a mutual edge means that both Bob and Alice claim that they're both friends with each other, which is kind of interesting. And I think it brings up, you know, another point is that just because someone says that you're their friend doesn't mean that they think that you're their friend. And that actually, there's a lot of research, you know, out of sociology and psychology that actually says that that's, you know, the level of agreement is pretty low. Sometimes it can be about 50% and 40, you know, and I think it actually is even lower when people haven't had opportunities to meet each other in person, which is kind of an interesting thing that I'll get into more because there's, yeah, Haley.
My question is, with that research, does a lot of it kind of boil down to what people's definition of friend is, rather than like trying to actively slight someone else?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. And it's because like, just like, and so one thing that's actually also been shown is that people's personalities really matter in terms, actually, that actually shapes how people perceive their networks. And so, yes, some people might think that only like best friends are considered friends, and other people might think that acquaintances are your friends. And so that's why a lot of things are never really symmetric. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but if you think about, you know, when we're thinking about larger networks and we're looking at the links, you have to really understand like what you're looking at in terms of really thinking, well, is it a directed or undirected? Does it matter that they're mutual ties? Because if it's people's perceptions, then everybody has different perceptions about it. And so it's just something kind of on the side to think about. Yeah. And then as I was, and then, so I think we looked very briefly at the individual, and then we looked at the dyad, which is kind of a subgroup. And then, at the network level, a very common metric to think about is the density. So the density is just a network property that is defined by the number of connections in the network that are there, divided by the total number of possible connections. And so if this network was completely connected, then it would have a density of 1. And this network is actually pretty closely connected. It has 7 out of possible 12. And, a lot of this is just because it's a really small network of 4 people. But you can imagine that as we get larger and larger in a network like this group has 1,000 people, most networks that are quite large tend to be pretty sparse because it's pretty difficult for everyone to really know each other, but everybody kind of knows a few people in their clusters, like maybe all the people who are part of the Boston meetup will kind of know each other versus people in San Francisco. And so it's very difficult for people to actually know everyone in a network. So, this is just a kind of a summary that, let's see, I feel like, so these are different properties in a network. And essentially, there's isolates, which represent if it has no links. A dyad we talked about means that it's 2 people with links between them. And then you can also think about triads, which is another group level. And triads actually get really interesting because once you get 3 people in the conversation, there's a whole bunch of different configurations that can happen between people. Just think about, as an example, if you're ever in a conversation with 2 people and then a third person joins, the nature of the conversation tends to change quite a bit. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but you can think about how if it's friendships, like maybe in this example, A, B may be really good friends. D might perceive that A is a good friend, so they might think that they have a link, but there's so many different configurations that are possible there. And then finally, a pendant actually is all 5 of these relationships. And so, people tend to look at the absence and the presence of these types of links to kind of understand like how the network is shaped and the types of relationships that are inside of the network. So anyways, that's kind of it for this example. And I'm generally an R user, but I basically, this can be produced in just a few lines of code. And I think it's very similar for larger networks too. I think the thought behind it is very similar. It's just that obviously your visualization gets bigger. And so this here is just to really show that we were talking a lot about friendships, but there's tons and tons of different types of networks. And this is just an example here of communication networks, which is really, really common. A lot of times we think about who do you interact regularly with? And so the ties here are determined by the number of people that you talk to regularly. But these ties can be made up of very many of different types of relationships. Like, for example, you can think about a link forming between people if they have similar interests, or if they're from the same area or the same city, or if they work in the same industry. And so you can really construct networks out of a whole bunch of different types of relationships, which is really going to just depend on what you're interested in learning. And so the same people that are in a network, if you think about where the ties are based on their industry, could look really, really different than a network that is with the same people, but their overlap or their network or their relationships are based on where they're from, for example. And so this is just to show that, there's different things or different visualizations of a network that can tell you that can convey different information. So on the left-hand side, here the nodes are sized by each person's out degree. And you can see that exact same network is pretty different if you think about people's in degree. And so the node size on the right-hand side is sized by people's in degree. And if you plot that distribution, it usually the out degree and the in degree distribution look pretty different. So these figures here basically show the number of contacts on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the percentage of nodes. And so what is really interesting is if you're thinking about an out-degree distribution, it generally tends to be kind of uniform in the sense that if you exclude this outlier here at 1, where people said that they had a lot of just one person that they talk to regularly. But generally people, it's pretty uniformly distributed in terms of the number of outgoing ties that people have. So in this case, it's between 2 and 10. But what is really interesting actually is the in-degree distribution. And this is super common in networks where a couple people tend to have most people have very few connections, and only a couple people have a lot of connections. And so it's the distribution in terms of in-degree and influence and popularity is pretty skewed generally in networks. And you can kind of see that in this example, which is based on the network before, which only had like 150 people in it. But actually physicists, where there's a couple, have shown that, networks tend to be scale free and they follow this sort of exponential sort of distribution a lot of times, and it's been replicated in a whole bunch of different settings.
I have a question, Jackie.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you can go back to the previous slide. I'm just curious why, why does this, I guess, why do the clusters appear different?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't really go into it. But really, so this network, and I'm going to use this kind of network as an example throughout for different things. But this is a network of working professionals who are in an online program, and it's in a business analytics program. And everybody starts in cohorts, and so essentially you can think about everybody in blue starting at the same time and everybody in yellow starting at the same time. And so you can see that there's like a lot of clustering in terms of who people talk to. And this is also quite common in networks because we tend to talk to the people that are easiest to access. And so if we started in a program together, we'll talk to them. If we live close to somebody, maybe not right now, but generally if you're neighbors or we live close together, you probably talk to them more than someone who lives in a totally different neighborhood, for example. And so, yeah, there's a lot of clustering. And what it suggests also is that the people that can bridge clusters, these are called brokers, people who have relationships, in this case, between the yellow and blue, are really influential because they're able to interact with others in the blue segment and then also the yellow segment. And so they get access to information quicker. Whether or not that's a good thing or not, it really depends on the context. And I think that's something you could talk about for a long time, whether you really want to be that broker in the middle and have that person be that person that gets connected to information quickly. There are people brokers tend to be people that you want to know though. Yeah, thanks. Are there any other questions?
I had a question on the other slide, not this one. I guess it would be slide 16 if this is 15. I just want to make sure I understand with the exponential distribution. So this is saying that there are, so then this is this two people? Is this two, so lots of people have two contacts? Can you just explain that? Lots of people have two contacts. Is that what that means?
Yeah, it's saying that this is a number of incoming contacts. So the number of people that said that they interact with you often. And so what it's suggesting here is that networks, in a typical network, most people only talk to a couple people. That's why there's two people who are saying that they talk to you. And it's usually there's some outliers who have tons of contacts, and it just so that's just the way that networks tend to be distributed, in the sense that I'm trying to think of. So
what you're thinking. Go ahead. I'm sorry. So what you're saying is that these 10 people are the fat dots in the other
Exactly. Yes. And so in that visualization, these are the people who
with the
have
10s.
most of the connections. Yeah.
Okay.
I
and to get that straight.
Yeah, thanks. So let's talk about, ways that you can collect your own social network data. And so I mentioned in the very beginning that there's two ways, and let's talk about them. There's an active method. And so this is what I think a lot of people have done traditionally, which is survey people. And so you survey people that you're close to, you survey, like, who do you interact with regularly? Who do you go to for advice? Who do you go to? Who are you friends with? And so those are active measures where you basically have to collect that data, and then you build your network based on those survey responses. And so it's based on self-reports. Another way is passive data. And I think this is becoming a lot, it's inevitable, and it's also a lot more popular these days because we have so much data that is being generated about us in the background. Whether it's our Slack communication or our Zoom meetings or emails, or where we visit on our browsers, and those all form what you can call digital trace data. That seems kind of like something that's going on that you don't even care about, or you don't even notice, but in a way it's generating data that's creating potential relationships and links between people, where you can study how people are linked and how people are accessing information in each other. There's, I think, pros and cons to both of them. In terms of active information, active methods, it's self-reported, and so it's also super dependent on the people that are responding. And because the moment you don't get people responding, then you lose a lot of information about your network, because you lose all of their connections, and those are really important for understanding how people are linked together. In terms of passive, that's always going on, and it's real time and it's continuous. But then the reason why sometimes we don't rely on that is because of privacy issues, I think. And I think privacy issues, and also it needs some interpretation of, if you see a Slack message or a bunch of Slack messages between people, is that a relationship or not? Like, how do you actually code, a work relationship or a friendship or an advice tie? And so people have there's a ton of research on this, actually, of taking things like likes and emojis and Slack messages and frequency of communication and @mentions, and basically looking at all of that type of communication and saying, okay, what weights do I put on all of this different type of communication to understand a link between people? And you can imagine that this is actually really important in organizations, because HR and managers are always trying to understand, how people are communicating with each other, who the influential people are in their companies, and how, what sort of information flows are happening versus being siloed or not happening. And so people and companies in particular, are focusing a lot more on this passive information. Not that it's bad, but it's probably happening without us even being aware of it. Anyways, I wanted to go to a different type of example, and this kind of builds on some of the work that I have been doing to really understand, the importance of having face-to-face contact. And when we're in this kind of remote world, if we don't have that, what are some ways that we can design interventions or opportunities that for us to actually have, social encounters with other people, and does that actually impact things like collaboration and our performance, and our potential job outcomes, actually. And so a lot of this is going to be focused on the dyad level. And this is building on those visualizations that we just saw, about that we just looked at it's the same online program with working professionals, and they're taking a business analytics program. And so what I've been doing is essentially following this program for the last couple of years to understand, how people are developing relationships with each other in this completely kind of online program. Before COVID, people only came to campus twice, and they have these immersions where people have these intense experiences with each other for 2 to 3 days. And then they continue back on. And so people come from around the world, from the US, from Asia and Europe. And so one of the things that I've been interested in is, well, there's lots of opportunities for people to interact with one another, but what sort of factors are actually important in terms of people developing real relationships with each other? And so this is just some snippets from some of that research, where in this case, we actually collected survey-based data on people, where each of the students reported the types of friends that they had in the program. And the question we asked them was, who are the classmates you have been most often for informal social activities, such as social and off-topic discussions, meeting up via Zoom, going out to dinner, drinks, and so on. And we had people respond to these questions and surveys that we administered every term. And then what we did was generate reports for the students so that they could have a sense of what their networks look like, and really understand who they were interacting with. So let me see if I can do this. Oh, wrong one. So these are some of the examples of networks that the students would have in the program. And I think it's pretty interesting because, so this first example here is someone's network that she has, where these are strong ties, in the sense that everybody reported that they were friends with each other. And so everybody is mutually linked here. What I think is really interesting is that those are all the strong ties where people are mutually linked. But look how big her network is when you think about just one-way ties. And so this is the aggregation of mutual ties and single ties. So it includes the mutual ties plus all of her outgoing ties and all of the incoming ties to her. And it's so much bigger, and which is really, really interesting. And so the ratio in this program is about 20% or so in terms of mutual ties versus single, all ties. And I think part of that is also because of the online element of it. And it's, even though people are interacting with each other and people have different, and taking into account something that Haley said earlier about people having different perceptions of what friendships are, it's something also about, not having meeting with people face to face also creates, I think, a little bit of this element where people are not necessarily perceiving each other as friends mutually. Anyways, so basically this is something that we give to all of the students, but it's also a great way for us to understand and do some research in there as well, in terms of understanding the factors that predict friendship formation. And so here, so what are the factors that influence, whether or not Dave will think of Dana as a friend? And so we have a bunch of similarity factors to think about, such as whether they're from the same cohort, whether they attended the same immersion, which is the same 3-day experience with each other on campus, whether they're from the same city, or the same race, same gender, same discussion group, like did they talk to each other at the immersion? And then, our outcome variable is, whether or not they have a friendship tie. And so what we found is that after examining all these sorts of factors, and by the way, all of these similarity factors are things that prior research has shown to be important for predicting tie formation. What we found, though, is that attending the same immersion and having that 3-day face-to-face experience with one another on campus was the biggest factor that predicted whether or not someone thought that they were friends with each other, which kind of tells you something it's a really intense program. People interact with each other all the time. They have classes 2 nights a week. They have to do peer learning sessions with each other. They go to discussion groups together. It's all online. But then and I've been to these immersions. They come together, and then it's magical, and people all of a sudden feel really close to each other, which is really, really interesting, right? Because it kind of makes you wonder what is happening to our relationships in this during this pandemic, where it's almost been a year where even though we have these opportunities to get together on Zoom, which is really awesome that we have things like Zoom, but it makes you also wonder, how much of these relationships can we sustain into the future, and are there things that we can do about it? And so my sense from at least looking at those immersions before this pandemic, I was convinced that the only reason why people had real relationships with each other in that program is because they got to come together for an immersion on campus and in person. And there's, a lot of articles that have been written about these kind of things, like how you need to have best friends at work, and you need to have those face-to-face encounters. And it's actually great because it makes you want to spend more time on your job, and it makes you a better employee. But only 2 out of 10 people strongly agree that they have a best friend at work. And so this is, this is a Gallup poll done in 2018, so a couple years ago. But what it suggested is that, that kind of chit chat and those lunch breaks and those water cooler conversations are actually super important for fostering friendships and also people's performance in the workplace. And so,
question.
Of course.
So was the immersion after a year of courses, or was it before the year of courses? I just wasn't clear on that.
Yeah, I know, a good question. I didn't actually mention it, but so they have, you can think of it as roughly a year-long program, and they come to the campus after about 2 months in the program, and then they come again when they graduate. And so the end of that year. And it's a flexible program, and so people can do it anywhere from 9 months to 18 months or so. But generally, they come in the very beginning after a few weeks together, and then right again at the very end. And at the end, it's just sort of like this big hurrah where we did this together and we're graduating. And so it's really that first time that they come together, which is really, really important for the friendships that they form and then also maintain through the program and beyond. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit already, but this is really getting at the fact that there's a lot of different ways to collect data on people. A lot of different ways to collect data. And so I think if any of you are interested in doing this type of network analysis and understanding different types of relationships, thinking about it, not just beyond, I think very obvious examples are things like Twitter is a network, Facebook is a network, Instagram is a network, where the people are the nodes, but there's also very, different types of networks. For example, companies, how are firms connected to each other? What are the relationships that matter? I think one area, at least at Lish, I think people are thinking about AI adoption. And so can you think about how firms adopt AI as a network in terms of, is it done by industry, or is it because they have a specific need? What are the ties that link the firms together that influence whether or not how quickly they're adopting AI, for example? And so, I have primarily talked about survey-based methods, but I think there's a lot of rich information that's out there, and I think it's a perfect opportunity for this group to, think about, what sort of things are we interested in learning about more. So anyways, I said that I was going to talk, I was convinced that, we had to be face-to-face for these things to happen, for this kind of serendipity to happen and these friendships to form. And so I really got interested in, what's happening to the quality of our relationships that we have with people now that we've been in this remote world for about a year. And obviously, I'm not the only person to ask this question because there's lots of articles that have been written about it. You know, remote, and basically the gist is that people think that remote work is productive, but it's missing something. And the thing that it's missing is really those water cooler chit chats, the time before and after meetings. And I'm talking about this in a very organizational context, which because I study organizations, but it also I think may apply outside of companies as well, to, you know, people that we meet, the people that we interact with, and the fact that we're humans and we are social beings. Anyway, so I think social network analysis can also be a pulse check for remote places in the sense that there's signs of social isolation and risk of turnover and burnout. And what I really mean by that is, so we started working with this company, and what we realized is that you can actually map networks and how they change over time. And so if you're thinking about, you know, leveraging email communication and Slack communication and looking at how people interact with each other, you have a moving picture of that in the before COVID, when COVID's hit, you know, a few months in, 6 months in, and now 1 year later. And so what is really striking, and I think and I think this depends on the type of company that you work in, or the type of communication and whether or not people work in teams. But there is a sense of this lack of ties that are, you know, you can see over time that there's ties that are disappearing from networks. And it's an indication that people who used to talk to each other are no longer talking to those individuals. Not to say that they're not forming new relationships over that period, but in terms of the persistence of relationships, some of those are going away. And it's because if you think about it, we used to try and avoid sometimes meeting people in the lunchroom if you're super busy, but it's like those kind of things that have been super important that we never really realized. And so, I've been working on this study that asks, like, can we actually create remote serendipitous encounters? And can we design these virtual water cooler interventions where obviously we're not like a physical water cooler, but we can leverage Zoom and we can randomly put people together in Zoom meetings, kind of like how you would randomly bump into people in a lunchroom or in a water cooler. And I'm just going to give like the highlight of what we found, but so just to give you a really brief summary of the company and the experiment, essentially what this company was that they have this big internship program that happens in the summer every year. And they recruit people who are in college, generally in their, who are juniors in college, and they come and they work for a 10-week internship. Because of COVID, it became a 5-week internship and everybody worked from home. And so everybody was in their own house, in their own home, but they still work together. And so as part of our experiment, there was the treatment group. Our intervention was basically to give some of these interns these opportunities to interact with each other through Zoom meetings. They didn't know who was going to be there beforehand, but they got to have these Zoom conversations with each other. And that was the kind of like the main intervention. So super simple, except that some of these interns also got to talk to senior managers in their water coolers. So in these Zoom conversations. So you can think of it as there's interns that didn't have these kind of opportunities. There's interns that got to have these opportunities with each other, and then interns who got to have them with senior managers. Essentially what we found is that those interns that had those opportunities to talk on Zoom with each other with senior managers, they had higher weekly performance. And so they were rated by their supervisors each week on how they were doing, and they got higher ratings. So it suggests that there's some sort of like information or communication, something that's going on there that is helping them perform better. But I mean,
can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
I wanted to know, are organizations that have denser networks generally better or like more productive or something? Or I just wondered. Do you?
I think that's a difficult question to, it's a great question, but I think it's a hard one to answer because I think it depends because I think there's a trade-off. And so if you think of, and the reason why I say that is because if there's no communication, then it means that nobody's collaborating and no one's talking to each other and everybody's doing things in silos. And so it could mean that people are not very productive because they could be overlapping in what they're doing or they're not leveraging people with the right expertise. On the other side of that, if everybody's talking to each other all the time and they're collaborating all the time, then I think there's this whole thing called like collaboration overload, and you go to a punch, you're always working together and nobody ever has the time to work on their own things. And so I think there's that sweet spot in between. I think it's different for every company and it depends on the size and depends on the industry and everything, but I think it's, for lack of a better way to describe it, I think there's some sort of trade-off and there's like a sweet spot in the middle of the amount of collaboration and the amount of communication and the density of those networks that you want. Yeah. And then, so basically, let me just finish with what we did in this experiment. So we found that the interns performed better, but actually what I think was really cool was when we actually examined their attitudes towards their internship on the last week. And those who had those opportunities for those Zoom meetings for 30 minutes, actually, with a senior manager, you think about it, it's like 30 minutes over 5 weeks, or in some, 30 minutes or maybe 2 of these opportunities, they actually felt like they were more satisfied with remote work and they had more opportunities for career advancement and mentorship. And they also felt that it was easier to go to others for help just by having these little small interactions. And so I think essentially, my takeaway from understanding this, from doing this experiment is that I was wrong that it's face-to-face that you really need, but it's really the opportunities for serendipitous encounters and these chance encounters with people that we may not necessarily have a chance to talk to regularly that are actually super important for, our social well-being, and then also if you're working in an organization, our performance and our outcomes. And so the last thing I'll say is that these interns who were in these kind of water cooler treatments were also more likely to get a job offer to return when they finished. And so, yeah, that's all I had. This is my last slide. So anyways, thank you so much. And I think we are out of time, but I'll give it back to Haley.
Thanks so much, Jackie.